So you click this video because you probably want to have a career or make a living in music in one way or another. And I've been fortunate enough to do that to some extent. And you probably are like, well, who is this guy? I've never heard of him. I've never seen him. And that is just proof of the fact that you can make a living without having to be this super famous chart topping artist or producer or whatever. Like you can make a comfortable living in the world of audio and music if you go about it the right way. And so I wanted to make a video that isn't any fancy cuts. There's no clips here. I'm not going to necessarily break down anything. It's going to be unedited. Just imagine like you're sitting across from me. So grab a cup of coffee or tea or just some water, whatever you want, and just sit back and watch it. It's going to be a little bit long. And like I said, I'm not going to edit this. Think of it as a one-sided conversation with somebody who's been fortunate enough to make a living off of music in the industry. And I'll talk a little bit about how I got started and how I got to where I'm at. And then I'll probably finish it up with some just general advice of what I wish I would have been able to tell myself when I was getting started. So like anybody in music, I guess the first thing I ever did was start a band. And so I was in bands in high school, and that was like really fun. And this happens a lot. I think when you're in a band, you're young, you're excited, and you're learning something new and experiencing something new, and you kind of start believing that you have something special, because it's not everyone in your high school or your friend groups that's going to start a band. You start feeling unique. You start feeling like I have something going for me that other people don't. And you might even be in a good band. But something I think people fail to realize sometimes is that for every success story, from like a young band that kind of, or artist that blows up, for every success story, there's probably thousands of failures. And failure meaning not that they necessarily made bad music or that nobody listened to it, but just that it wasn't sustainable enough to, make that a career. And so the first piece of advice is a little cynical, but I would kind of say, kind of really be aware of where you stand. Are you putting all of your eggs into one basket with the idea of becoming an artist or a band that's going to make it? If you really dig into the histories of a lot of successful artists and bands, you'll see that many of them, I would say virtually all of them, didn't necessarily start in their current iteration. People are generally in lots of different projects before they get the experience to be in the right one that does end up blowing up. Now, of course, you have your Billie Eilishes and your Post Malones and stuff, and it does happen, but I think it's important to realize early on, like, okay, maybe the band isn't going to make it. So that is kind of what happened to me. I started realizing, I don't think the band's going to make it. And so I started getting serious about the idea of like, how can I do something in this realm of audio and music that will allow me to keep doing this and somehow make money so that I can pay the rent and, live off of this. And I wasn't somebody that was good in high school. I had a pretty low GPA. I was just a bad student. Later on, I realized it's probably because I had ADHD. Now I've been diagnosed with it. So it's like, oh, well, cool. I wish I would have known that back then. But I realized that I needed to focus on something that I was actually passionate about. So I chose to go to a school that taught audio engineering. That school was Full Sail. I won't talk too much about that here. I have a whole other video if you're interested on my channel called Is Full Sail Scam a University? And that's the title of it, and that should be indicative of maybe my thoughts on it. But not a terrible school, just overly expensive. I don't know if I recommend doing that, but it did give me a really strong foundation in audio engineering, which is something I didn't have before at all. And suddenly the world opens up. Now you're not just guessing around. You realize there's a science to it. There's a really technical skill around it. And you've essentially learned a trade, no different than becoming an electrician or a plumber or anything else like that. You can now do something that most people can't unless they've specialized in it. And that alone opens up a world of possibilities, which I didn't know about until I went to college and I started talking to people and meeting people and getting ideas that like, oh, well, there's audio everywhere. There's audio and not just music and bands and stuff like that. There's television, there's radio, there's video games, there's live events, whatever. It's a lot bigger of a field than you could possibly think. And that was the first thing that I realized, where I kind of, something changed in my perception, or my perspective, better yet, that I was like, okay, well, if I had to choose between an office job or something that remotely has to do with audio, I'll take that any day. So I started kind of looking into different worlds that I could somehow get involved with audio. And you'd be surprised, the same way I didn't know anything about how much audio has to offer. So many people didn't know. Like there was people making, videos for YouTube that were just like, oh, I didn't even know audio mixing was a thing. Like they just think that you just put a microphone there and that's it. But once you learn about the more technical stuff like compressors, EQs, mixing theory, signal flow, all of the basics and the foundational stuff, you already learn a lot more. So my first piece of advice, I don't necessarily think that you have to go to a university for this or study it like that intensely, but buy some books, go on YouTube. Be careful with YouTube because there's a lot of iffy information, but learn what you can and put yourself above the rest in terms of like what you can pull off technically. Because it is a skill that you have to develop over time, and it's not something that it's not very easy. It takes time to develop. And so once I did that, I was lucky enough to do really well in college because I was very engaged in it. And whereas before in high school I had terrible grades, I did really well in college and I had better grades, close to being top of the class. I still wasn't very good at the whole studying and all that stuff, but it was easier for sure. And then once I got out, I think I had this kind of perspective, again, holding on to that idea of like, if I have to choose office job or something just above an office job, but that has to do with audio, I'll take the audio. And one of the mistakes I think I saw a lot of my classmates make, and to no one's fault because I get it, it's like we're all here because we essentially want to live the dream. But I think I was maybe a little bit more realistic about it, and I realized like the dream is pretty far away. And I had a lot of friends and classmates that just went further deeper into like the whole idea of like, I'm going to become an artist and I'm going to be successful now that I have the tools to do that. And a few of them actually did okay. Like some of them went more directly into the studio world and got to work with like cool artists and stuff like that. But a lot of them, now that it's been over a decade since that time, just completely left the world of audio. So I try to be a little bit more practical. I started kind of messing around wherever I could. I would find somebody, like if they needed audio in any way, I would just help them. If there was a friend that was shooting a short film, I was like, I'll do the audio for it. And just trying to be flexible. My first big kind of like break was that when I moved back home, I live in Miami. So I moved back to Miami and I started just emailing and calling different studios around, and the one studio that actually got back to me for an internship was a studio that specifically worked in the world of audio post and music production for television commercials. And that was something very foreign to me. Like, it had never really crossed my mind that television has jingles and all the music written for commercials, unless it's licensed. I always just thought it was like, okay, this must be some obscure band I've never heard about. But I never realized like most of these songs are being created by a company that specifically like works in that world, where their entire job is to make jingles essentially. And at first I was like, I don't know if this is what I want to do, but I gave it a shot. I kind of worked really hard at the internship. It was an unpaid internship, and I don't recommend taking an unpaid internship, but I'm going to be the first to tell you that sometimes that is the reality. I think a lot of people are still kind of like, oh, I don't want to do an unpaid internship. And like I said, I don't recommend it, but kind of like a dirty secret is that if it's a good enough opportunity and you're willing to like put up with it for a little bit. And mind you, it's not like I had a bunch of money just lying around that I was just like, okay, cool, I'll be fine. I'll just do internships for a while. No, like I was like, I need a job fast, but it was very much a kind of like, okay, I'm just gonna bust my ass. I'm gonna really make it happen, and I'm gonna try to get myself hired. And that's what happened. I was lucky enough to do that, and I learned a ton. I learned a ton in that studio. I learned about music production. I learned about recording voiceovers and voice actors. I learned how to direct talent, vocal produce, I guess, to some extent. I learned how to work with clients, which was huge. Like, I learned how to communicate with people on a professional level. And that's something you should not sleep on. Like, really, really learn what it means to put your ego aside on anything that you work on and focus on the project at hand. So if the project is at hand is a McDonald's commercial where the song's going to be super cheesy and you got to finish it off with that iconic ba-da-ba-ba-ba, then you got to suck it up and do it. I mean, sometimes you do something that you're just like, this isn't cool. And that's going to be the way it is. But you have to remember, this isn't about you. It's very easy as a musician or as an artist in general to always kind of inject your ego and your musical perspective into everything you do, which is not a bad thing, but you have to know when to let go and be like, all right, this isn't even my song. This isn't about me. This is about selling hamburgers, you know? And that helps a lot because you start learning that ego doesn't really get you anywhere. If you want to make your own music that's entirely you and unfiltered and you do things exactly the way you want to do them, you have the opportunity to do that. But if you want to actually begin making a career where people are willing to pay you to do things in the world of music or audio, then you got to drop the ego. Drop the ego is like the best advice I can give you, and I can tell you, and you know this, musicians have the biggest egos. Musicians look at everyone else, and for the most part, they're always just kind of like, yeah, that's not cool because of this or that or this or that. And it's just like, look, at the end of the day, if a career is what you're trying to build, there is a little bit of like capitalism involved in that, and you do got to play the game a little bit. And you can kind of be, look, I'm not a huge fan of that. I'm not a huge fan of the idea of working 9 to 5. Not a huge fan of the idea of just like life revolving around the workforce. But if you do want to get to a point where you can do things for yourself at your own pace, on your own terms, you got to play the game for a while. It's just the harsh reality. And that's kind of what I did. I did that for a long time. And through that, I saw that there was a lot of different worlds that you could work in. And so I was constantly trying to put my foot in any door that I could find, whether that was like, okay, cool, I learned that now you can do audio post-production, which meant like mixing the dialogue and adding sound effects and sound design to like short films. So I did some short films that I worked on. I helped out some modding community on some video games to like provide sounds and music for that, all while I was still working in this studio as my 9 to 5 job. Eventually, I also along the way picked up voice acting. It's something that I kind of always had an interest in, but I had no idea how to start. By the nature of being working in a studio where we recorded commercials and stuff, we met a lot of voice actors and we had a lot of them coming through, and I kind of started learning through osmosis, just proximity, how they do that. And it's not as simple as just talking to a microphone, even though that's what people think. People think like, oh, you got to have a deep voice and just talk into a microphone. And I don't have a cool voice, really. But I realized that it's less about your voice and it's more about your delivery and all that stuff. And so that was another thing. I started doing that. And all of these things that I'm talking about, even my 9 to 5 was not a great paying job, but I started just constantly putting out feelers on like, where can I make a little bit of money? And again, I was not becoming wealthy at all during any of this, but I was really just trying to see what I resonate with the most. And obviously throughout that, music was the main thing, but I kind of realized like if you can do a little bit of everything, you can kind of make a little bit of money here and there, and then before you know it, you're like, oh shit, I don't need uh, a second job doing something that has nothing to do with audio. And after that, I was lucky enough to just start getting involved with different people and started messing around more with like music production. I worked on some cool stuff for Nickelodeon and different big clients. Before you knew it, I was working with names that I think everyone could recognize. And that felt cool. I was like, okay, I'm doing it. I think I'm making a living. And this is a very key, important part of my takeaway from looking back on those years, is that it's very easy to get caught up in, number one, something that makes decent money, and number two, something that feels legit, something that feels like you're doing a thing that like people are like, oh wow, that's cool. And like, you know, like in the advertising industry, they have awards and stuff. And sometimes you would work on a project that would win an award and you would think like, oh wow, like I did something that won an award, and like you get your little cool statues and all that stuff. And that's not a bad thing. It's cool. It feels nice to be rewarded for something that you put a lot of effort into. But it becomes a little bit of a misdirection. You start kind of forgetting what it is that you really want out of music and audio. And, you know, you start becoming an adult. You have more responsibilities. You have more bills. And before I knew it, I was in a position where I was still working in the same field, and it was almost like a decade in. And I was getting burnt out because I was making music that I didn't necessarily want to make. I was still putting effort into it, and I was still proud of stuff that I would work on, but it wasn't really like music, the way I wanted to work on it. And so it became this thing where I almost started doubting whether or not I even liked music. And eventually, to make a long story short, I got so deep into this where I was making good money, and this was my career. But I was completely burnt out, and I felt like stuck. I was like, oh man, I've hit a wall here. Like I've invested everything into this idea of like music and audio, and now I hate it. And so I made the very difficult decision to quit. And I just took some time off. And at that point, I started realizing like, okay, I don't hate music. Once I like kind of decompressed a little bit, I was like, I don't hate music. I still want to do music. Is there a middle ground here where I can still work a little bit in the kind of like audio post and like commercial world and just do odd jobs here and there that have to do with audio, and still make a living doing that while, you know, working in on stuff that I actually feel passionate about? And the answer is yes. I've been fortunate enough that it has worked out, but I don't want it to sound like it's just like, oh, I just got really lucky, or it's just me because I'm super hyper talented. It's like, I'm not. I'm pretty normal. Like I've met so many people in the industry that are at my level or slightly below it or slightly above it, but it's very rare that you run into somebody that's just like, wow, that guy's a genius. And everybody's just making a good living for the most part. Like everyone's able to do it. The key, I think, is to really focus on when you're going through that playing the game part of your life and you're really grinding, try to really make as many connections as you can and explore every possible facet of audio and music. Like there's a million different ways that you can make a little bit of money, and don't get caught up with this idea that it's all one big payday. Like that exists, but that's so much more difficult, and I don't recommend chasing that. Like focus on just spreading out your skills and your abilities and making those connections, because that's what's made the difference now that I've transitioned into freelancing, where I was able to just purely focus on doing my own thing, but also, you know, working audio for a convention where I just ran all the audio, and editing podcasts, and mixing YouTube videos, and still working on some audio post-production stuff for like short films, and just that's the kind of thing that's been able to carry me through while I've now been focusing on producing artists and my own music, and that slowly is growing into its own thing. My battery's about to die. Let me stop this real quick. So my battery died there. Apologies, but I'll just finish off here because I pretty much covered how I got to where I got. And I know it's not maybe ideal in terms of like what you were hoping to hear, like, oh man, like this is how it is, and you get to just be a big artist. There is other paths. This is just my path and how I've managed to kind of make a living doing this. And so I guess I'll just close off with some just general advice that I kind of wrote down here. One of the biggest things I wish I had told myself early on is when you begin working with anyone in whether it's like a large project or a full-time job at a studio or something like that, move on when you feel like you've stopped learning. Like if it's been a month that you've been on a project or at a job and you don't feel like you're learning anymore, it's time to move on. And that's going to feel very, very, very difficult to do, because especially if the money is like pretty decent, and especially if you're working in a studio environment, it's kind of like this thing of like, oh man, this is so great. This is everything I wanted. I'm living the dream. But the reality is that when you stop learning, you will burn out. You just will. And it's a sad truth, and it's something that I avoided for a very long time, and I stayed at a company, or two companies actually, for too long. And I knew deep down inside, I was like, I stopped learning. I'm not really feeling stimulated anymore. This isn't doing much for me. But you stay because, again, bills, life, you're an adult, you need to do stuff. But for your own sanity, if you are serious about making a career out of music, and a career isn't just about making money, a career is about, it's throughout your life. It's what you're able to accomplish in your specific field. So in music, if you just stay at one place and you stop learning, then I mean, your career ends there. As much as you can keep that job and keep making money, the career is done. There is no growth. So huge advice I wish I would have given myself is like, if a month or so passes and you're not learning anything, get out of there. It's time to move on. Find something new. Don't do what I did. I quit without having a backup job. I was lucky enough to where it worked out. Don't do what I did. But, start lining up something else and make your next move. Another piece of advice, it's never going to feel like you made it. Like that's just a reality. I look at where I'm at now, I don't feel like I've made it. And yet I look around and I'm just like, well, everything that I have and everything that I've accomplished was because of music in a way. So it's almost like I didn't have to work a different kind of job or career. I was able to do this, and I was able to pay off my debts through music, all that stuff. And still, it doesn't feel like I made it. If 16-year-old me saw me today, I would have definitely been like, dude, you made it. Like you got a synth and like guitars. You got like more than one guitar, and you got like mics, and they're like good speakers, and you go into studios, and it's like, dude, you made it. And it's just like, maybe this is just a me problem, but I feel like it's pretty common when I talk to a lot of like my peers. It never feels like you made it. I have a friend that works with like artists that are like chart topping artists. Like he is in the studio with them. He knows artists on a personal level, and he's just like, I don't feel like I made it yet. Like I don't feel legit yet. So go easy on yourself. Somebody's dragging something across. But anyways, go my neighbors. But anyways, go easy on yourself when you're working on creating a career for yourself. It's about the journey, not the destination. Blah blah blah. Those cliches. I mean, they're cliches for a reason. It's true. Just enjoy the process. That's my last piece of advice. Enjoy the process, and don't let technicalities get in the way. there's going to be a lot of people that have opinions about how you should move forward with your career. There's a lot of times that you're going to slow yourself down because of things that you've learned, or like, just remember every facet of the industry is very different. So if you learn to do something a certain way in the world of music advertising, it's very different than if you're in the studio with, an artist and producing them. So there was a while there when I kind of got very technical about my engineering, and I was very like, oh, well, this rule is like this, and you always need to do this and cut these frequencies here, and every vocal needs to be tuned and like perfect, and like you need to line up things to the grid. And that's just like, no, well, that's one way to do it, but you have to learn to like let go sometimes, and just ultimately trust that when something feels right, the process doesn't matter as much. Like if we're talking about songs and production, for example, the moment you hit play, nobody cares how you mixed it. Nobody cares if the instruments were looped or if they were recorded live. The reality is like, if you hit play and what comes out sounds good and pleasant to your ears and everyone else's ears, you're good. Don't overthink it. Like, really, just don't overthink it. I wish I would have stopped overthinking stuff a long time ago. And it's a learning process. I'm still learning to be a little bit more easy with stuff like that. But try not to overthink it. It's important to just keep moving forward. And like I said, don't fall into one narrow point of view on how a career is supposed to look like or how success looks like. It might be that you do write that one song that blows up and makes a career. But even then, I've seen a lot of people that I've met in the industry that have had hit songs that got radio play. They made their money off of it, and then nothing really happened after that. And so it's not as simple as just like making it, like, because there is no making it. It's just constant. The wheel is constantly turning. So always look for opportunities. Don't think you're above any opportunity, because things change, trends change, demands change. Just always be flexible and nimble and willing to kind of make it work for you. And once you find the things that do work for you, don't make that your whole thing, because then you're giving up the passion side of things. So try to balance it. Give yourself some room for exploring your passions, even if they make you no money. And also don't neglect the more financially savvy part of your abilities. So anyways, this is obviously a long video. I hope you learned something. Feel free to ask any other questions in the comments. I'll probably answer them. And if there is enough questions that I can just kind of compile, I might make another follow-up video to this where, same format, I just kind of talk to the camera and answer those questions. But thanks for watching. If you're interested in content like this, subscribe to this channel or check out some of the other videos. That's it. I wish you the best of luck in your music career. I know this is a cliche, but if you really, truly commit yourself to it and you believe in yourself, things will work. Not always in the way that you expect them to, but they will. You can make a living. It's not impossible. I'm living proof. The entire time I've been doubting myself, and that's why it never feels like I've ever made it. But I wanted to make this video to prove that you can make it. And so go for it.